Welcome. My name is Joe Skelly. I'm the treasurer of ASMEA, professor in New York City. I'd like to welcome you to our panel today. We have three great papers that we're going to hear from, four speakers. The theme of our panel is local and foreign militaries in Africa, a very relevant topic. Apropos, from a historical perspective, we'll begin with our first speaker, Dr. Jochen Arndt from Virginia Military Institute, and the title of his paper is "A Comradeship-in-Arms?" East German-Angolan Military Relations During the Cold War, 1975 to 1990. Welcome, Jochen.
Thank you very much. I did preload some slides, and I wonder if I could have the clicker.
Oh, this is
it? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. There we are. Okay. I'll step up here. Gets me more into a zone. Yeah. So thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for being here. My topic, Comradeship in Arms. I'd like to set the scene for this a little bit. Maps always help to set the scene. So between 1975 and roughly 1990, Angola was a Cold War conflict zone. If we look internally, three competing nationalist liberation movements were sort of fighting for who would control Angola during this period. We have the MPLA, the FNLA, and UNITA. I spare you sort of the longer versions of these names. Externally, though, and that's what really made this a Cold War conflict zone, is that these liberation movements also received support from external Cold War powers. So in the case of the FNLA and UNITA, they received support covertly from the United States and more overtly from apartheid South Africa. And the MPLA received support from the Soviet Union and from Cuba. And what is less known is that they also received quite significant support from East Germany. And just to give you sort of an example, in 1978, during a visit to Angola, the East German Defense Minister, Heinz Hoffmann, actually promised what he called in German a Waffenbrüderschaft, a comradeship in arms, to the MPLA in its fight for control of Angola. Over the last year, I have done research in several archives that used to belong to East Germany. Germany collapsed in 1990. I visited the military archive in Freiburg, I visited the diplomatic archive in Berlin, and I also visited the state security archive, also in Berlin. And based on those resources, based on this archival evidence, I'm asking and I'm answering this question: did East Germany really provide a comradeship in arms to Angola? A little bit of historiography. I'm a historian by training. We always like to situate our arguments within a broader body of work. So earlier accounts of East German-Angolan military relations would actually have answered this question with a resounding yes. Yes, East Germany did establish a real comradeship in arms with Angola. As early as 1976, the West German weekly Der Spiegel accused East Germany of supplying both military instructors and heavy weaponry to the MPLA. By 1980, Western media began describing East Germany's military role in Angola and Africa more broadly as a new Africa Corps, a pointed allusion to Nazi Germany's Wehrmacht operations in North Africa during the Cold War. Now, more recent accounts answer this question very differently. Actually, they answer it with a more or less resounding no. East Germany did not form a comradeship in arms with Angola. And one of the most important works in this vein of scholarship is Klaus Storkmann's book, Geheime Solidarität, or Secret Solidarity, Military Relations and Military Aid of East Germany to the Third World. Now, as the title suggests, this book casts a very wide net. It doesn't focus specifically on Angola, but nevertheless, it's important work on East German-African military relations. And although it does not cover East Germany's role specifically in Angola, it does argue, and that has implication, I think, for Angola, it argues that really East Germany was hamstrung by its weak economy. It didn't have the financial resources to provide significant aid at any point in time. Also, or specifically so, because it preferred to use its limited financial resources for defense in Central Europe. Now, the purpose of my research is to provide the first focused study on East German-Angolan military relations, but also offer somewhat more nuanced answers in this debate and to the specific question I asked at the beginning. Let me start by pointing out what actually motivated East Germany's interference or establishing military ties with Angola in the first place. Well, starting in 1950, so this is shortly after the Cold War, West Germany and East Germany competed for legitimacy. And West Germany's diplomatic efforts were guided by the Holstein Doctrine, which thought to isolate East Germany on a global scale. East Germany, for its part, tried to fight back and challenge this Holstein Doctrine by establishing ties, diplomatic but also military ties, with countries of the Third World, notably in Africa, and I would argue specifically actually Angola. I found a document from 1963 that already clearly sort of states that East Germany was interested in supporting these liberation movements in Angola with the purpose of undermining the Holstein Doctrine. Now, East Germany was motivated by other factors as well. So, for example, socialist internationalism is important. That's an ideology that argued that in the pursuit of establishing a socialist global order, existing socialist powers, such as East Germany, had actually the duty to support emerging socialist-oriented movements, especially those engaged in liberation struggles and anti-capitalist struggles. And arguably, the MPLA in Angola presented itself as a socialist movement in that sense. The GDR also pursued economic interests in Angola. A report I found from 1976 clearly stated that the East Germany was interested in the natural resources of Angola, notably its crude oil and its coffee. Actually, East Germany had a very vibrant coffee culture, but always had real trouble getting coffee, getting access to coffee. Could, of course, do it on the world market, but that would have meant paying for the coffee in dollars, and East Germany didn't have a lot of dollars. So a way around that was to receive supplies from friendly socialist countries such as Angola, and that was certainly on their mind. So they thought, okay, can we mix military relations and economic relations, whereby East Germany provides sort of weapons and training, and in exchange we get crude oil and coffee, and that was certainly part of the negotiations. Now, one thing I want to make absolutely clear is that the Angolans were not passive recipients of East German military aid. Actually, they actively thought out this military aid. For example, by taking the initiative and writing letters. For example, in 1975, during a very critical period in the Angolan struggle, it was MPLA leader Agostinho Neto who wrote a personal letter to the leader of East Germany, Erich Honecker, and asked him to provide military aid in this critical period. And NATO followed up this letter by writing a second sort of a message, this time to the East Germany's Central Committee of the Socialist Unity Party, again asking for help proactively. And that repeated itself again and again. So Angolans were very much in the driving seat and taking the initiative. I would also want to point out that the MPLA leaders convinced the East Germans that they were actually bona fide socialists and therefore deserving of that socialist military aid. And we can get a sense of that when we look at documents from the East German Minister of Defense, Hoffmann, and this is the top one actually from 1978. Well, from 1978, where Hoffmann, the defense minister of East Germany, clearly sort of is convinced that his counterparts, his MPLA counterparts, are good socialists. And he writes, in Angola, the leadership is rooted in Marxism-Leninism. Its members are mostly experienced cadres, matured in exile and partisan struggle, who are truly committed to the revolution and socialism. In the interest of time, I'm moving a little bit forward. So far, my discussion suggests that military relations between East Germany and Angola developed within a context shaped by East German and Angolan actors and interests. So what about the nature of East Germany's military relations with the MPLA, and what type of military support did East Germany actually provide? Well, the records that I looked at from the East German Ministry of Defense indicate that in the period from 75 to 76, again, this crucial period of the first year when they were actively, the various liberation movements were fighting each other for the control of Luanda, East Germany delivered arms and munitions valued at about 20 million marks. These were heavy weapons and munitions. And I think it's quite reasonable to suggest that the MPLA, that these armaments helped the MPLA win control of Luanda in these critical years. Now, in these early years, military support arose from direct contract between high-ranking politicians, and they sort of unfolded on an ad hoc basis. I already mentioned sort of the letter writing of NATO to Erich Honecker, and then Erich Honecker making sort of giving his thumbs up to delivering this aid. However, to strengthen and formalize these military relations, between the two countries, East Germany decided to send well-trained military attachés to Angola, to Luanda, starting in 1976. And they had these military attachés in Luanda until the very end, until East Germany collapsed. The military ties were further strengthened through high-ranking military delegations which visited Angola various times, most notably in 1978. And then these more formal military ties led to additional military aid. For example, right after the visit in 1978, East Germany agreed to supply an additional 7.2 million marks worth of military armament and equipment. The protocol from these meetings in 1978, the protocols also suggest that the MPLA asked East Germany to provide extensive technical officer training and non-commissioned officer training in East Germany for its cadres. In other words, sending them to East Germany to participate there in military courses, military training courses for up to a year or 2 years. Now, East German military officials made a comprehensive proposal to the Angolans, to the MPLA, shortly afterwards in 1979. They proposed to train 10 to 15 Angolans annually, starting with border troops at the end of 1979, followed by air and air defense forces at the end of 1981, and ground forces at the end of 1982. It also estimated that between 79 and 85, 93 Angolans could be trained as military medical personnel in the GDR. Now, what is interesting is, in spite of these very ambitious plans, these plans were never implemented. Now, I don't have the time to go into what exactly did transpire, and maybe I can talk about this later on. But these very ambitious plans of actually sending military cadres to East Germany and having them trained as officers and non-com were never really executed. And I think this raises an important question. Well, why? What's going on, and what does that tell us about military relations between East Germany and Angola? Well, I think there are a couple of factors that I would like to, here we are, explaining this sort of achievement gap. Well, one, I think, are bureaucratic obstacles. So, for example, when plans for border security cadre training were first made in 1979, responsibility for border security in Angola resided with the Angolan Ministry of Defense. However, a year later, that control shifted to the Ministry of Security. And the Ministry of Security, I see that in the records, didn't pick up on this topic again until 1981, so 2 years later, 2 years lost. However, exactly at that time, the Minister of Security in Angola, Dino Matros, came himself under a lot of political pressure in the so-called Diamond Trials. And actually in 1986, he was fired from his job. However, the Angolan government did not appoint a successor until 1988. Well, 1988 is only like a couple of years before East Germany itself collapsed. So these kinds of bureaucratic problems certainly didn't make executing these cadre training programs easier. Ironically, I would say that the close ties that Angola already had with the Soviet Union and Cuba also didn't help, because that meant that the Angolans had a lot of options. The KGB provided training for its staff, and the Cuban security services also provided a lot of training options for the Angolans. And of course, both of those were heavily invested in Angola already. For example, Cuba with almost 30,000 ground forces. And I think here it makes sense to juxtapose this a little bit with the Mozambican experience. Mozambique certainly also received support from the Soviet Union and from Cuba, but not to the same extent. It wasn't that dependent on those two actors. And maybe that explains why Mozambique, unlike Angola, trained actually 258 of its cadres as officers in East Germany during this period. Now, another thing we need to recognize is that East Germany had its own limitations. So in some cases, East Germany simply did not have the expertise that the Angolans were looking for. For example, in 1985, the Angolan Minister of Defense, Tonya, asked East Germany to train 100 pioneers in mine detection and mine detection dog handling. And the East Germans responded in a letter simply saying, we don't have that expertise, we can't help you. Another occasion, the Angolans, the MPLA, asked for warplanes and warships, and the East German industrial base just didn't have the means to produce warships and warplanes on a scale that would have allowed them to hand some of those over to Angola. Another issue that came out in the records is actually academic unpreparedness of some of the Angolan cadres. In order to go to a military institution, educational institution in East Germany, the recruits, foreign recruits, had to meet the same educational standards as East German recruits. And the problem was that many of them didn't. In the case of the Angolans, many of them didn't. For example, a 1983 report states that the recruits from Vietnam, the People's Republic the People's Republic of the Congo, of Zambia, they all met those standards, but those of Yemen, Laos, Mozambique, and Angola didn't. There were also different cost-sharing expectations. The MPLA really hoped that all military aid would be provided free of charge under the guise of socialist aid. However, by 1983, a top-secret report from the Ministry of Security encouraged the East German Ministry of Defense to only or to prioritize, I should say, cadre training from states that were willing to pay. And maybe that's already a reflection of East Germany finding itself sort of a little bit in a financial bind in the 1980s. Now, I think we should also recognize that there were some diplomatic faux pas. And I'm just giving you one example. So one notable example occurred when the Angolan Minister of Defense, Tonya, visited East Germany in 1982. So the East Germans were appalled when Tonya, during the opening speech of his visit, spoke of, and I quote, the rich West Germany and the poor East Germany. As you can imagine, the East Germans didn't find that funny at all. There were a couple of other things when they were taking the bus to visit some of these military educational institutions. Tonya and his group apparently preferred to play cards or nap rather than ask what the East Germans expected, intelligent questions about these military institutions. And I'm sure the East Germans committed their own faux pas. But the more faux pas happened, the less willing each side was to actually sort of take this relationship to the next level. Another thing, and this is the final point I want to make, is by the second half of the 1980s, the MPLA in Angola was actually strategically realigning itself. And I got this, at least, from a top-secret East German intelligence report that read, and I quote, particularly influential forces within the Angolan state apparatus oppose close cooperation with socialist countries. In its relations with the United States, the People's Republic of Angola strives to establish diplomatic ties. In other words, the Angolans were moving away from the socialist sort of powers and more toward the capitalist powers, notably the United States. And in that sense, it didn't make any real sense to move some of its cadres to East Germany to be trained there as officers. So my point is this: the achievement gap in cadre training especially can be explained or should be explained with a combination of factors. To simply argue that it was because East Germany didn't have the financial means, as some recent historians have done, doesn't give us really the complete picture. So to conclude, in 1978, during his visit to Angola, the East German Minister of Defense, Hoffmann, pledged that East Germany would establish a Comradeship-in-Arms, a Waffenbrüderschaft, with the MPLA. My paper has asked to which extent was that ever, did that ever become a reality? I conclude that while East Germany did provide important military aid, so almost important emergency military aid in these critical years, 75, 76, maybe even all the way to 1980, its ambitious sort of cadre training plans were never fully implemented for a whole range of reasons. And I would argue because of the achievement gap in cadre training, I would also say that this promise of a Waffenbrüderschaft, a comradeship of arms, never really materialized. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good. Fantastic. Thank you. Jochen, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. We appreciate your comments, and welcome to members of the audience who've arrived. This is a terrific panel on local and foreign militaries in Africa, and our next speaker is Professor R.M. Douglas from Colgate University. And Ray, do you have a PowerPoint? No. Okay, great. Okay, terrific. So Professor Douglas is going to talk about the following topic: Blow 'em All Away, Rape, Race, and Reprisal in North Africa. Professor.
Hi. Okay, hear me all right? Forgive the barbarous accent. In May 1943, 4 U.S. soldiers from the 910th Air Base Security Battalion straggled back to their camp at an airfield in the far northeast of Algeria. Their pace was slowed by the 5th member of the party who'd been shot in the leg. On reaching their base, the squad related how, while on a routine patrol that morning at a village to the west of the airfield, they had been ambushed by a large number of Algerian civilians armed with automatic weapons who fired on them without warning, pinning them down in a ditch. An exchange of gunfire lasting nearly an hour then followed, the Americans barely escaping with their lives. The base commander, Major James Hicks, a policeman in civilian life, lost no time in orchestrating countermeasures. He told the officer in charge of base security to handle the matter as the security officer saw fit, but added that if it were left to him, and I quote, he would get the half-track out and blow 'em all away, referring to the villagers. Thus encouraged, the security officer formed a party of about 50 soldiers, including some of the ambush victims, and returned to the village with half a dozen armored vehicles. On reaching the scene, a 3rd commander, the battalion intelligence officer, ordered the troops to open fire with machine guns and rifles. In the fusillade, a local resident was injured. Several soldiers rushed him as he lay helpless on the ground and riddled him with bullets before looting an adjoining house. Satisfied with their work, the expedition withdrew, warning the villagers that unless all privately held weapons were turned in, the entire population would be forcibly deported. Now, what appeared to be a small but successful counterinsurgency operation took on a different complexion when an unusually conscientious officer of the Judge Advocate General's Department, the Army's military justice agency, carried out a thorough investigation of the killing. Inquiries revealed that the original story of an ambush was entirely fictional. As one member admitted, the group had gone out that morning in search of sex and had gang-raped the first woman they found, a young Algerian mother, as she breastfed her baby in a farmhouse. While in the process of moving on to an adjoining farm to repeat their offense with any women they might find there, they were driven off by a male resident who had used his shotgun to defend his female relatives from attack. To cover their tracks and perhaps obtain revenge against the man who had bested them, they constructed the fable that led to the raid and the killing later that afternoon. The significance, I think, of this episode lies in the complex interrelationship of its racial, sexual, and legal dynamics. The 5 rapists were black, as were the enlisted men who took part in the punitive expedition, the officers white, the victims impoverished Algerians. In consequence, military authorities found themselves attempting to satisfy a variety of objectives, some standing at cross purposes to each other. As the occupying power in Algeria, the United States was bound by international obligations to defend the lives and property of the civilian population under its control. It had a strong interest in maintaining military discipline among its forces so as to prevent possible civil disturbances as a result of lawless or provocative actions. But it was also conscious of the need to ensure due process for US soldiers accused of wrongdoing, including those belonging to racial minorities. How the military justice system negotiated these competing imperatives reveals a lot about the difficulties experienced by the US Army in North Africa in reconciling the quest for justice in the abstract with the requirements of the larger mission of defeating the enemy in the field. It also demonstrates, significantly, that racial attitudes and prejudices among US forces were less binary in nature than is often assumed. Now, Operation Torch, the Anglo-American invasion of North Africa in November 42, presented the US Army with a number of sensitive cultural and political problems. The US forces were multiracial in composition, as were the civilian population in the midst of which their operations were being conducted. The still segregated US Army, for its part, was grappling with intense racial tensions between white and black troops that manifested themselves in periodic physical clashes and small-scale but significant mutinies and refusals of orders in protest over discriminatory treatment. US military leaders, though, were under appreciable domestic pressure to ensure that the first major deployment of African American servicemen in an active combat zone during the Second World War would be a successful one. Sexual violence by American troops against North African civilians, which, unless involving the rape of white French colonists by white soldiers, would be an interracial crime by definition, threatened those objectives and was certain to inject further instability into an already volatile situation. Maintaining the goodwill of the local population and avoiding as far as possible from aggrieving or provoking them were in consequence seen by American commanders as military as well as diplomatic imperatives. It was against this backdrop that the gang rape took place. The 20-year-old victim was attacked that morning by 3 of the Americans, while 2 others held her down. The perpetrators, as I say, then made their way to an adjacent farm where the young nephew of the owner motioned to them to stay away, showing them his shotgun. They responded by opening fire upon him. In the exchange that followed, one of the rapists was injured and the gang then fled. Accounts by the numerous participants and local eyewitnesses of what happened several hours later, when the Americans returned in force to take revenge, differ in significant details. But it was generally agreed that as the troops approached, local residents scattered. 3 Algerians testified that they saw one of the villagers who was fleeing on horseback being shot out of the saddle, and watched as they put it, the colored soldiers approached him and discharged their weapons into his body as he lay on the ground. The rapist's original story fell apart when local residents reported the crime against the woman victim earlier that morning. Under questioning by military lawyers, one of the rapists implicated his Confederates. But in the view of the US investigating officer, no less important a consideration was judicial action against the commanders, whose precipitate response had led to the deliberate execution of the Algerian civilian. The investigator recommended that the matter be brought to the attention of Army headquarters for possible disciplinary action against the 3 white commanders who had authorized and participated in the raid. Little of the kind, though, was to follow. In early 1944, the 5 rapists were brought to trial on rape and housebreaking charges in a common court-martial. They stood by their original story of an ambush, the initially cooperative perpetrator having by then retracted his previous confession. When an Algerian witness referred on the stand to the afternoon killing by the Americans, the law member of the court-martial ordered that his statement be stricken from the record, declaring, "It has nothing to do with this case." All 5 defendants were convicted and received the mandatory minimum sentence of life imprisonment, although each was freed on parole after serving just 7 years behind bars. I should say that such leniency was entirely typical of US servicemen convicted of rape during the Second World War. Any indulgence extended to the black offenders, however, paled into insignificance when compared with the Army's kid-glove treatment of their white officers. The principal author of the Reprisal Party, Major Hicks, cheerfully reported in January 1944 that the file on the investigation of him and his colleagues had already been lost. The sole consequence he incurred for his part in the killing was an administrative reprimand, a sanction that had no adverse effect on his military career. Within 6 months, Hicks had been promoted and finished the war as a full colonel with a Bronze Star and a Legion of Merit medal. Shortly after the war, in a political appointment, he was elevated overnight from the rank of traffic patrolman to become chief of police of the city of Sacramento, California, a position from which he retired in 1965. None of the other officers involved received any disciplinary action for their part in the affair. Now, there can be no doubt that the killing and the raid as a whole were unlawful acts according to U.S. military law. A further lapse on the American commander's part, to which investigators drew attention, was the inclusion of 3 of the rapists in the rifle platoon that sought revenge for the non-existent ambush. The possibility, therefore, exists that one or more of the perpetrators killed the Algerian victim as he lay on the ground, doing so in the belief that they were eliminating the man with whom they had exchanged fire earlier that day, and the only witness who could contradict their story. It was then unlikely that senior commanders would wish to delve too deeply into an episode that might reveal that army officers had overstepped the boundaries of military and international law in a manner that had had the effect of enabling a group of their soldiers to perpetrate a deliberate murder so as to conceal another capital felony of which they were guilty. If the authors of the operation were aware that their actions lacked the sanction of military law, as seems probable from their subsequent conduct, that invites the question of just what it was they believed themselves to be doing. Some scholars have differentiated between reprisals, in the 1940s accepted by international lawyers as being in accordance with military exigencies, and punitive expeditions, sometimes sardonically referred to in the British imperial context as butcher and boat operations. In the words of the Australian scholar Chris Ballard, the essential characteristic of punitive expeditions is, and I quote, their fundamentally spectacular, exemplary, and tutelary employment of violence, one of whose principal aims is to impress native populations with the superior status and physical inviolability of the foreigners exercising dominion over them. In its essentials, the Algerian incident conformed closely to this pattern. American soldiers in North Africa, believing themselves to be surrounded by an uncooperative and unpatriotic populace that was liable to help the enemy or even engage in armed resistance, developed a sense of vulnerability that was accentuated by having been thrust into an environment whose differences of language and culture seemed especially alien and incomprehensible. These tendencies were accentuated by the general dislike of and disdain for North Africans that was a common factor among American forces, regardless of ethnicity, race, or rank, for the non-European peoples of the region. At the conclusion of Operation Torch, for example, General George Patton wrote to his nephew, and I'll quote, "The more I see of Arabs, the less I think of them. I am getting so that they have the same effect upon me as a toad." That attitude was broadly shared. Black U.S. servicemen charged in other sexual offense cases in Algeria indicated that they, like their white officers, had been taught to fear and distrust North Africans. Numerous instances were recorded of black as well as white U.S. soldiers using North Africans and Middle Easterners as well as their livestock for target practice, and of systematically abusing these indigenous civilians under their control. Given that background, the striking readiness of all the white officers of the 910th Base Security Battalion to accept without question the story of their black troops about having been ambushed, despite its inherent implausibility, and to organize an immediate punitive expedition to avenge the insult offered them, is easier to understand. For the commanders, no process of investigation was necessary because the word of black American soldiers was to be trusted, whereas that of North Africans, invariably generically described by them as Arabs, was not. The punitive expedition was therefore justified by what American servicemen of all ranks and races had already determined to be the deceitful nature of the North African character. That this understanding was shared by the rapists themselves was underlined in a 1948 appeal by one of their members to have his case reopened. In his affidavit, the man expressed outrage that the testimony of North Africans had been accepted over his and that of his comrades. How about the reliability and credibility, he inquired, of the Arabs, who are known liars and thieves? Here I am, an American soldier who is spending the very youth of my life in prison because the liar of an Arab woman was accepted against 5 American soldiers. Now, unexceptional though it may seem in the context of a global war in which much worse atrocities against civilians were almost too numerous to mention, this tragedy still offers several useful insights for the historian. It calls into question Benjamin Schneider's suggestion that an antinomian worldview instilled into American soldiers during the Second World War during combat training helps account for the readiness of some to commit extra-legal acts of violence and many others to justify such excesses. This incident occurred 125 miles behind the front line. The soldiers who murdered an Algerian man and raped an Algerian woman had neither been brutalized by combat nor trained for it. However, considerable evidence indicates that officers and men, black and white, were united in their hostility toward and fear of the North African population among whom they were deployed. The origins of these attitudes are complex, but doubtless were fueled by early 20th century images in US print and visual media of the region as exotic, impoverished, insanitary, uncivilized, and inhabited by people who paradoxically combined cowardice and fanaticism to a high degree. That shared perception of being surrounded by an alien and menacing population could also have the further effect of narrowing the racial gap between black and white servicemen. The avidity with which the officers of the 910th leapt to the defense, as they saw it, of their ill-treated enlisted men may have, and doubtless did, owe something to paternalistic attitudes on their part, which, to be sure, was characteristic of the officer corps in general, or to a desire to uphold the dignity of the uniform their subordinates wore. It nonetheless gave evidence of a recognition on their part of shared American identity that justified and demanded swift and robust action on behalf of their black troops. Even in an age of segregation and intense anti-black animus, it demonstrates the scope for a degree of malleability in wartime of entrenched racial attitudes, albeit one achieved at the cost of the tragic victimization of a still more stigmatized ethnic outgroup. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Professor, for an outstanding paper and for your deep insights into this episode. Next, I'd like to tell the audience about our paper. It's called The Lived Experience, Soviet Assistance to African Militaries. First, we'll have an introduction by Dr. Whitney Grespin, who's part of the Irregular Warfare Initiative. She'll tell us about the study, and then I'll introduce the main speaker.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this and everybody for coming on a Sunday morning.
Can you add the microphone? Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for everybody.
Yeah,
To
perfect.
everybody for coming on a Sunday morning. I also need to clarify that I'm here in a personal capacity, and this project does not reflect any U.S. government opinions, and more importantly, is the product of an ASMEA research grant. So thank you to the organization for supporting this. I just wanted to offer a couple framing remarks before handing it over to Claudia, who is an adjunct professor at the Columbia School of Journalism. And we are not historians. So this project comes out of my background as a practitioner, and the genesis was a knowledge gap when I was working as an embedded advisor in Somalia at the Ministry of Defense in Mogadishu. And this aims to fill a gap that the Somalia U.S. Embassy, Department of State, Office of Security Cooperation, and lack of Somali archives were able to fill. So again, ASMEA supported a research project that I did some years back where I had gone and attempted to collect interviews in Mogadishu, but because of security considerations only had one. So that paper ended up looking more at arms transfers from the Soviet Union over to Somalia, and then the pivot to U.S. support to the Somali regime under Siad Barre before the fall into civil war. And so I was able to reapply this year and bring on Claudia, who has an investigative journalism background and experience. And so this grant supported interviews that we were able to conduct in Puntland and Mogadishu earlier this year. So over to Claudia for the paper.
Okay, thank you so much. And now Claudia.
Hi.
Who is an adjunct assistant professor of journalism at Columbia University. Welcome.
Hi, thanks everybody, and thank you, Whitney, for the introduction to the project. I was fortunate enough to be her research assistant and co-author this summer, and I'll just go ahead and get started. Oh my goodness.
The microphone. Clicker.
Oh, oopsies. Thank you. All right, so just to provide a brief historical overview. Remind me if I. So this study falls against the backdrop of the Soviet presence in Somalia and their military training in Somalia during the 60s and 70s up until their departure in 1977. And to zoom out a little bit more, this is also within the geopolitical movements and fluctuations between the West and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And during the Soviet Union's presence in Somalia and during their military training processes, this was also amid a lot of military assistance, not just through training, but also through arms and officers. Alongside military training was also sort of an ideological component to this education as well, that could be called indoctrination, but also includes Marxist-Leninist ideological components in this training and during this education as well. Again, was sort of zooming out amid the context of countering Western influence. And like I mentioned earlier, a financial factor as well. More than $55 million were also contributed to Somalia in arms, advisors, and infrastructure. Okay, so the current literature on this topic is largely from a very macro level, looking at the global powers of the United States, the West, and the Soviet Union at the time. And there have been some very helpful scholarship on the universities in the Soviet Union at this time, and the universities where Somali students did attend and Somali military personnel did attend to receive military training. Ivanova explores Somali students in the Soviet Union and highlighted cultural and ideological tensions at the time. And then there was a really interesting study and oral history by Alexander and McGregor, which includes oral histories and personal accounts of mainly military personnel in Zimbabwe and their experiences with trainers from Cuba and Soviet Union. So to go into where our research sort of fits into this, we wanted to build off of already this broader look at these movements and this training and speak to those who were personally part of this, either as students or who were there at the time where the Soviet Union was present in Somalia. We spoke to returnees trying to get that sort of perspective of those who had experiences following the Soviet withdrawal in 1977, and also sort of frames Cold War aid from a recipient rather than donor perspective. So Somali officers' experiences in the Soviet Union were marked by cultural adaptation, language learning, and ideological tension. So there were many different types of training alongside the military training. A lot of students who went to the Soviet Union from Somalia didn't know Russian even at all when they arrived in the Soviet Union, either in Moscow or Leningrad. And so this was also the sort of education that they received as well as part of their sort of assimilation into these universities. And as I mentioned earlier, included teachings on Marxist-Leninist ideological stances as well. There's sort of a mixture of responses. We heard very positive experiences as well as some resentment. So I'll go ahead and give a couple of examples based off of people who we spoke with. We spoke with a former Somali student in the Soviet Union. He spent 9 years between Moscow and Leningrad as a student. He is also somebody who, when he arrived in Moscow, didn't know any Russian and now knows, I think, 5 languages and learned Russian while he was there. He looked back pretty fondly on his experience in Russia, or in the Soviet Union at the time, which we found pretty interesting. Ivanova, I believe, cited when in that research on sort of the cultural and ideological tensions, instances of racism that African students, not just Somali, but also other African students who did attend these universities, racism that they experienced, which ultimately led some to leave universities and defect to places like West Germany. But he countered this and did not express that he didn't experience any of that. And in fact, were contrary to his impressions of what was happening at the same time in the United States in the 60s. He also expressed a very deep distrust in the West, which, went alongside with his positive experiences with the Soviet Union. And also is not a perspective found by other authors within the research of this topic. So this was a really interesting interview to build off of the existing literature. To sort of foil that experience, though, we did speak to a Somali colonel and a former general who were present in Somalia at the time of Soviet Union presence and military training. They both expressed resentment and dissatisfaction, to say the least. This particularly has to do with the sudden withdrawal of the Soviet Union in 1977 and the lack of infrastructure and support that was left over when they left, when the Soviet Union left. And they attribute this to the eventual onset of the civil war in Somalia in 1991. And so while they didn't note any negative interactions one-on-one with Soviet Union officials or military personnel in Somalia at the time, this was more of a broad sense of resentment based off of the way in which the Soviet Union established themselves within Somalia and then left without helping lay the groundwork to move forward without them there. And so with that, when the Soviet Union left, they left an over-militarized and aid-dependent state, and a a lot of Somali forces struggled to sustain these Soviet-built systems and move forward. However, Soviet training doctrines continued to influence Somali command structures and overall Africa's broader security landscape. And then Dr. Grespin's going to take over this slide.
Terrific. Okay, great.
Thanks. Yeah, this slide just speaks to areas of future potential research and realizing synergies with other attendees here in literature. From a practitioner and kind of policy standpoint, right, this is very important for us to understand command and control in current militaries. Somalia is a unique case because there was a total state collapse, but you still have Soviet-era colonels and generals, and learning, again, from their command and control and sort of doctrine and oversight and personnel management, sort of how can current security cooperation, security force assistance programs dovetail or at least understand those experiences. So in the Somali case, the U.S. working with DANAB, the Turkish mission, their largest embassy in the world is in Somalia, and they are the #1 security assistance provider in Mogadishu through Turksam. Sort of what are the parallels with their training program design as they take Somali soldiers to Turkey for training, as well as less formal engagements on the Emirati side of the house with some of the other clan militias. So lots of areas of future research. I think much more broad applicability. Would love to collect more interviews, but certainly in the Somali case, because as I mentioned, there are no archives. They were all destroyed during the Civil War, and rapidly dissipating personnel availability because they're getting old. And that is beneficial because some of them are then more willing to talk, but on the other hand, a number of interviewees declined because they said it's in the past, it was pre-Siad Barre, it was pre-Civil War, there's no point in even looking at it. So thank you for your time and attention, and looking forward to questions and answers.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you.